What happens when centuries of tradition collide with modern intellect? When Queen Isabella Thornfield decided to test her elite Royal Guard intelligence on an ordinary Tuesday morning, she had no idea she was about to shatter every assumption about power, wisdom, and respect within the ancient walls of Ravenshollow Castle. In just 31 seconds, a simple challenge would expose truths that had been hidden for generations, leaving everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about their beloved queen and the men sworn to protect her. The morning mist clung to the ancient towers of Ravenshollow Castle like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the weathered stone. Queen Isabella Thornfield stood at the massive arched window of the throne room, her silhouette framed against the pale dawn light. At 52, she possessed an elegance that commanded attention without effort. Her silver-streaked auburn hair caught the early sunlight, and her emerald eyes held a sharpness that had served her well through 23 years of rule. Today felt different, though she couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the way Captain Marcus Blackwood had dismissed her concerns about the kingdom's educational reforms during yesterday's council meeting. Or maybe it was the patronizing tone Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Ashworth had used when explaining military strategy to her, as if she hadn't been making life-or-death decisions for her people since before he'd even joined the Guard. Isabella turned from the window as the heavy oak doors creaked open. The morning briefing was about to begin, and, with it, another day of polite condescension wrapped in ceremonial respect. She watched as her elite royal guard filed in, their polished armor gleaming, their expressions serious and professional. These were supposedly the finest men in the kingdom, handpicked not just for their physical prowess, but for their intelligence, loyalty, and judgment. Captain Blackwood entered first, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. At 38, he was the youngest captain in the Guard's history, having risen through the ranks with impressive speed. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, and his square jaw held the kind of confidence that came from never having been truly challenged. Behind him came Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth, a man whose gray temples and lined face spoke of decades of service, yet whose eyes held a dismissive glint whenever they fell upon his queen. The other guards followed in perfect formation. Sir Edmund Fairfax, the strategic advisor whose family had served the crown for 4 generations. Commander Vincent Sterling, whose reputation for tactical brilliance was legendary throughout neighboring kingdoms. And Lieutenant Gabriel Thornwick, the youngest of the group at 26, whose eager eyes and quick reflexes had earned him a place among the elite despite his relative inexperience. "Your Majesty," Captain Blackwood said, executing a precise bow. "We're here for the morning briefing regarding the border dispute with the Northern Territories." Isabella nodded, settling into the throne that had been carved from a single piece of ancient oak 5 centuries ago. "Of course, Captain. But before we begin, I find myself curious about something." The guards exchanged glances, their formation remaining perfect despite the unexpected deviation from routine. Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth's eyebrows raised slightly, his expression suggesting mild annoyance at the delay. "Your Majesty?" Captain Blackwood prompted. Isabella leaned forward slightly, her fingers drumming against the armrest of the throne. "Tell me, gentlemen, what do you believe makes a truly intelligent ruler?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and unexpected. Commander Sterling was the first to respond, his voice measured and diplomatic. "Wisdom gained through experience, Your Majesty. The ability to see the larger picture and make decisions that benefit the greater good." "Knowledge of history," added Sir Edmund, his aristocratic accent crisp. "Understanding the mistakes of the past to avoid repeating them." Lieutenant Thornwick, eager to contribute, stepped forward slightly. Strategic thinking, Your Majesty. The capacity to anticipate consequences and plan accordingly. Isabella listened to each response with growing amusement. These were textbook answers, the kind taught in military academies and recited in council chambers. But they revealed something else, something that had been gnawing at her for months. Interesting, she mused, her voice taking on a tone that the guards couldn't quite interpret. And what would you say about a ruler's ability to think quickly, to solve problems under pressure? Captain Blackwood straightened, sensing they were being led somewhere. Intelligence and quick thinking are certainly valuable assets, Your Majesty, though they must be tempered with wisdom and consultation with advisors. The subtle implication was clear. A ruler shouldn't rely too heavily on their own intellect when they had experienced military minds to guide them. Isabella caught it immediately, and her eyes glittered with something that might have been danger. Advisors, she repeated slowly. Yes, I can see how that would be important for someone lacking in natural ability. Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth cleared his throat, perhaps sensing the shift in atmosphere. Your Majesty, if I may, the border situation requires immediate attention. The Northern Territories have been making demands they have no right to make. Isabella finished smoothly. Yes, I'm quite aware. I've read every report, analyzed every treaty, and consulted every relevant historical precedent. In fact, I believe I may have found a solution that our military advisors overlooked. The silence that followed was thick with tension. It was one thing for the Queen to involve herself in military matters, quite another for her to suggest she had insights her trained advisors had missed. Of course, Your Majesty, Captain Blackwood said carefully. We would be honored to hear your thoughts. In a moment, Isabella said, rising from her throne with fluid grace. But first, I'm genuinely curious about something. You see, there's been some discussion in court about the intellectual capabilities of our various departments. Some rather unflattering comparisons have been made. She began to pace, her silk gown rustling softly against the stone floor. The guards remained at attention, but she could see the confusion growing in their eyes. What sort of comparisons, Your Majesty? Sir Edmund asked, his tone cautious. Oh, the usual courtly gossip, Isabella said with a wave of her hand. Questions about whether physical prowess and intellectual acuity can truly coexist, whether those chosen for their strength and fighting ability possess the mental agility required for truly complex problem-solving. The insult was delivered so smoothly, wrapped in such elegant language, that it took a moment for its full impact to register. When it did, Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth's face flushed red above his uniform collar. Your Majesty, I must protest. Isabella's voice was silk over steel. Oh, I'm not suggesting anything myself, Colonel. I'm simply curious about these claims. In fact, I thought perhaps we might settle the matter definitively. She paused in her pacing, turning to face them directly. The morning light streaming through the windows created a halo effect around her figure, but her expression was anything but angelic. A simple test, she continued. Nothing too challenging, just a basic assessment of logical reasoning and quick thinking. The sort of thing any educated person should be able to handle without difficulty. Captain Blackwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What kind of test, Your Majesty? Oh, something perfectly reasonable. Perhaps a series of puzzles, logical challenges, mathematical problems. The kind of thing that demonstrates true intellectual flexibility rather than mere memorization of military doctrine. The gauntlet had been thrown down, though it was wrapped in velvet and presented with royal courtesy. Isabella watched as pride warred with caution in each man's face. They couldn't refuse, not without appearing to validate the very criticism she'd mentioned. But accepting meant submitting to judgment from someone they privately considered their intellectual inferior. "Your Majesty," Commander Sterling said slowly, "while we would naturally be honored to participate in any exercise you deem worthwhile, perhaps such matters would be better addressed after we've dealt with the pressing military concerns. Are you suggesting that the elite Royal Guard cannot spare a few minutes for intellectual exercise?" Isabella's tone remained pleasant, but there was something sharp underneath it now. "Surely men of your caliber can demonstrate both military readiness and mental acuity?" She had them cornered, and they all knew it. To refuse now would be tantamount to admitting weakness or worse, cowardice in the face of intellectual challenge. Captain Blackwood squared his shoulders. "Of course not, Your Majesty. The Royal Guard is prepared for any challenge." His eyes met hers directly, and she saw both respect and resignation in them. "We would be honored to demonstrate our capabilities." "Excellent," Isabella said, clapping her hands together with apparent delight. "I do so enjoy settling these matters definitively." She moved to a small writing desk positioned near the window and began gathering materials: parchment, ink, several leather-bound volumes she had placed there earlier that morning. The guards watched with growing unease as she prepared what was clearly a premeditated examination. "Now then," she said, turning back to them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "shall we see what our finest minds can accomplish when faced with a truly level playing field?" The great hall felt smaller somehow, as if the very walls were pressing closer to witness what was about to unfold. Queen Isabella arranged the materials on a circular table that had been brought in from the library, an ornate piece carved with mathematical symbols and astronomical charts, a relic from the reign of her grandfather, King Aldrich the Scholar. "Gentlemen, please be seated," she said, gesturing to the chairs arranged around the table. "This won't take long." The guards moved with military precision, but Isabella noticed the subtle signs of tension. Captain Blackwood's slightly rigid posture, Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth's barely contained scowl, Commander Sterling's calculated calm that didn't quite mask his annoyance. Only Lieutenant Thornwick seemed genuinely curious rather than affronted, his young face showing interest rather than indignation. "Before we begin," Isabella continued, her voice carrying the authority of 23 years of rule, "let me explain the parameters. This will be a series of challenges designed to test various aspects of intelligence: logical reasoning, mathematical ability, pattern recognition, and creative problem-solving. Nothing beyond what any well-educated person should be capable of handling." She paused, letting her gaze move from face to face. "The first person to solve each challenge correctly will receive a point. At the end, we'll see who among us, and yes, I'll be participating as well, demonstrates the highest level of intellectual acuity." Sir Edmund shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Your Majesty, surely it wouldn't be appropriate for you to—" "To what, Sir Edmund?" Isabella's voice cut through his protest like a blade. "To demonstrate that a queen's education extends beyond embroidery and court etiquette." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella had struck at the heart of their assumptions, and they all knew it. In their minds, she was the figurehead, the symbol of the crown's legitimacy, but not its brains. Military strategy, economic policy, diplomatic negotiations. These were matters for advisors, for men who understood such complex affairs. "Of course not, Your Majesty," Sir Edmund said quickly, his face flushed. "I merely meant—" "I know exactly what you meant," Isabella said, her tone now carrying an edge that could cut glass. "And that, gentlemen, is precisely why we're here." She moved to stand behind her own chair, but didn't sit. Instead, she reached for the first piece of parchment and held it up so they could all see the symbols drawn upon it. Our first challenge is a simple one, a logical sequence. She placed the parchment in the center of the table where all could see it clearly. What comes next? The sequence was indeed simple at first glance. 2, 6, 12, 20, 30, 42. Captain Blackwood leaned forward immediately, his confidence evident. This was exactly the sort of straightforward problem he'd expected from a woman's idea of an intelligence test. The differences increased by 2 each time, he said after barely 10 seconds of consideration. 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. So the next number will be 56. Lieutenant-Colonel Ashworth nodded approvingly. Sound reasoning, Captain. But Isabella was shaking her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I'm afraid that's incorrect, Captain. Would anyone else like to attempt it? Captain Blackwood's confident expression faltered. He looked at the sequence again, his brow furrowing. But the pattern is clear, is it? Isabella asked. Commander Sterling? Sir Edmund? Any thoughts? The two men studied the sequence more carefully, their initial confidence shaken by the captain's failure. Commander Sterling was the first to venture another guess. Perhaps it's not arithmetic progression, but geometric? No, that doesn't work either. He trailed off, frustration creeping into his voice. Lieutenant Thornwick, who had been quietly studying the numbers, suddenly straightened. It's not about the differences between consecutive numbers, he said slowly. It's about the numbers themselves. Each one is the product of 2 consecutive integers. 1 times 2 is equal to 2. 2 times 3 is equal to 6. 3 times 4 is equal to 12. 4 times 5 is equal to 20. 5 times 6 is equal to 30. 6 times 7 is equal to 42. So the next would be 7 times 8 is equal to 56. He paused, looking uncertain. Wait, that gives the same answer as Captain Blackwood, but through different reasoning. Isabella's smile widened. Close, Lieutenant, but still not quite right. You're thinking too conventionally. She walked around the table slowly, like a predator circling its prey. The sequence is indeed based on products, but not consecutive integers. Look more carefully. The room fell silent, except for the soft scratching of quills as the guards worked out calculations on spare parchment. Minutes passed, and Isabella could see their confidence eroding with each failed attempt. Perhaps, she said finally, you're overthinking it. Sometimes the most elegant solutions are also the simplest. She leaned forward and wrote the answer on a fresh piece of parchment. 56. But, Your Majesty, Captain Blackwood protested. That's the same answer I gave, with entirely wrong reasoning. Isabella interrupted. The sequence is n plus 1, where n starts at 1. 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 plus 1 equals 6, 3 plus 1 equals 12, and so forth. But here's what you all missed. There are actually 2 valid patterns in this sequence, and both lead to 56. Your reasoning, Captain, was correct by accident. Lieutenant Thornwick's was methodologically sound, but incomplete. She paused, letting this sink in. True intelligence isn't just about getting the right answer. It's about understanding why that answer is correct, recognizing multiple valid approaches, and acknowledging when your reasoning is flawed, even if your conclusion happens to be accurate. The guards exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't going as any of them had expected. However, Isabella continued. Since this was meant to test quick thinking as well as accuracy, and since multiple approaches led to the same answer, I'll award points based on both speed and methodology. She made marks on a score sheet. Lieutenant Thornwick receives full points for correct reasoning. Captain Blackwood receives half points for speed, but incorrect logic. Captain Blackwood's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The criticism stung, particularly delivered so clinically in front of his subordinates. "Now then," Isabella said, producing another parchment, "let's move to something more challenging." This time, she presented them with what appeared to be a simple riddle. A farmer has 17 sheep. All but 9 die. How many sheep are left? Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting he found this almost insultingly easy. 8 sheep, he said immediately. 17 minus 9 equals 8. Several other guards nodded in agreement, but Isabella was already shaking her head. "I'm sorry, Colonel, but that's incorrect. Would anyone else care to try?" The confidence that had been building in Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth's face crumbled. He read the riddle again, more carefully this time. 17 sheep, all but 9 die, that means... His face went pale as he realized his error. 9 sheep, Lieutenant Thornwick said quietly. All but 9 die means 9 survive. Exactly, Isabella said, making another mark on her score sheet. This tests not just mathematical ability, but careful attention to language and the ability to resist the temptation of quick assumptions. She looked directly at Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth. "In military matters, Colonel, would you say that careful attention to detail and resistance to hasty conclusions might be important qualities in a leader?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Everyone in the room understood the implications. This wasn't just about mathematical puzzles anymore. "Of course, Your Majesty," Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth said stiffly. "Excellent. Then you'll understand why I find it concerning when my military advisors demonstrate such impulsive decision-making tendencies." Isabella moved to the next challenge, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. What had begun as a somewhat condescending exercise, humoring their queen's intellectual pretensions, had become something far more serious. She wasn't just testing their intelligence. She was systematically dismantling their assumptions about her own. "This next problem," she said, placing a new parchment on the table, "involves a classic logical paradox. You have 3 boxes. One contains gold, one contains silver, and one is empty. Each box has a label, but all 3 labels are incorrect. You may open only one box. How do you determine which box contains what?" The guard studied the setup she had drawn. 3 boxes labeled gold, silver, and empty. Commander Sterling spoke first, his voice careful and measured. "If all the labels are wrong, then the box labeled empty must contain either gold or silver. If I open that box and find gold, then the box labeled silver must be empty and the box labeled gold must contain silver." "Good reasoning," Isabella acknowledged, "but you've only solved one scenario. What if the box labeled empty contains silver?" Then Commander Sterling paused, working through the logic. "Then the box labeled gold would be empty, and the box labeled silver would contain gold." "Correct," Isabella said, making notes. "So the key insight is that you must open the box labeled empty, because that's the only choice that gives you complete information regardless of what you find." She looked around the table. "Anyone else want to attempt the reasoning?" Sir Edmund cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, while I appreciate the intellectual exercise, I'm not certain I see the practical application of such puzzles to matters of governance." Isabella's eyes glittered dangerously. "No practical application, Sir Edmund. Consider this. Every day, I receive reports with conflicting information. Military intelligence that contradicts diplomatic sources. Economic data that seems inconsistent with trade reports. The ability to reason through incomplete or potentially false information isn't just academically interesting. It's essential for effective leadership. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone that somehow made her words more menacing rather than less. When you gentlemen provide me with your expert recommendations, you're essentially asking me to open one of 3 boxes based on labels that may or may not be accurate. The question is, do I trust your labels, or do I apply logical reasoning to determine the truth for myself? The silence that followed was profound. Every guard in the room suddenly understood that this wasn't a game, wasn't a frivolous intellectual exercise designed to amuse a bored queen. This was an examination, and they were all failing it in ways that went far beyond simple mathematics. The tension in the great hall had become almost unbearable. Queen Isabella could see the realization dawning on her guards' faces. They were not just being tested on their intellectual capabilities, but being forced to confront the uncomfortable truth about their own assumptions and prejudices. The morning light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the ancient stone floor, and with it, the power dynamics in the room were shifting as well. "Now," Isabella said, her voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade through silk, "let's move to something that requires not just logical reasoning, but creative thinking." She produced a sheet of parchment covered with what appeared to be a complex diagram, a series of interconnected circles, squares, and triangles with numbers and symbols scattered throughout. "This is a problem I encountered while reviewing our kingdom's taxation system last month," she explained, placing the diagram where all could see it. Each shape represents a different type of tax revenue. Each number represents the amount collected from various regions. The symbols indicate special circumstances, wars, famines, trade disruptions that affected collection. Captain Blackwood leaned forward, studying the diagram intently. His earlier confidence had been replaced by wariness, but he was still determined to prove himself. "Your Majesty, this appears to be more of an accounting problem than an intelligence test." "Does it?" Isabella's smile was razor sharp. "How interesting that you would make that distinction, Captain. Tell me, do you consider the ability to analyze complex, multivariable systems to be less intellectually demanding than memorizing sword techniques?" The insult was delivered with such elegant precision that Captain Blackwood actually flinched. "Of course not, Your Majesty. You simply assume that because this problem relates to governance rather than warfare, it would be somehow beneath your intellectual capabilities." Isabella's voice remained perfectly controlled, but there was steel beneath the silk now. "How reassuring to know that my military advisors hold such high regard for the complexities of actually running a kingdom." Lieutenant Thornwick, who had been quietly studying the diagram, suddenly straightened. "Your Majesty, if I may, this isn't just about taxation, is it? The pattern of symbols, they're not random. They're telling a story." Isabella turned her attention to the young lieutenant with genuine interest. "Go on." "The circles represent agricultural regions, the squares represent merchant centers, and the triangles represent mining areas. But the symbols—" He traced a path across the diagram with his finger. "They show how disruptions in one area cascaded through the entire system. A famine here led to increased pressure on trade routes there, which in turn affected tax collection throughout the eastern provinces." "Very good, Lieutenant," Isabella said, and for the first time since the exercise began, her approval was genuine rather than sardonic. "And what does that tell you about the nature of governance?" Lieutenant Thornwick hesitated, clearly aware that he was venturing into dangerous territory. That everything is connected, Your Majesty. That a ruler must be able to see not just individual problems, but the relationships between them." "Precisely." Isabella said. And now, perhaps, you can understand why I find it somewhat troubling when my advisors approach each crisis as if it exists in isolation. She moved around the table again, but this time her pacing seemed less predatory and more pedagogical. Every decision I make sends ripples through the kingdom. Increased military spending here, and agricultural investment suffers there. Sign a trade agreement with one neighbor, and another feels threatened. Grant tax relief to merchants, and the Treasury struggles to fund infrastructure projects. Sir Edmund shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Your Majesty, surely you don't handle such matters without consultation. Consultation, yes, Isabella interrupted. But consultation with advisors who apparently believe that intelligence and decision-making are separate skills, who seem to think that a queen's role is to nod approvingly while others do the thinking. She stopped beside Sir Edmund's chair, and he could feel the weight of her gaze. Tell me, Sir Edmund, when you provide your recommendations, do you do so because you believe I lack the intellectual capacity to understand the complexities involved, or because you assume I simply can't be bothered with such details? Sir Edmund's face went white. Your Majesty, I would never suggest, and yet, Isabella continued relentlessly, your behavior suggests exactly that. The simplified reports, the patient explanations of basic concepts, the careful avoidance of technical details, all of it designed to make complex matters accessible to someone you clearly believe to be intellectually limited. She returned to her position at the head of the table, but remained standing. Which brings us to our next challenge. This time, she didn't produce a written problem. Instead, she began to speak, her voice taking on the rhythm of someone reciting from memory. I want you to imagine a scenario, she said. The kingdom faces 3 simultaneous crises. A drought in the southern provinces threatens the harvest. Raiders from the eastern mountains are harassing trade caravans. And our neighboring kingdom to the west is demanding reparations for damages allegedly caused by our merchant ships. She paused, letting the complexity of the situation sink in. Military action against the raiders would require moving troops from the southern border, leaving our drought-stricken farmers vulnerable to bandits seeking to exploit their desperation. Paying the Western Kingdom's demands would drain the treasury resources needed to purchase grain from northern allies to offset the poor harvest. But ignoring their demands might lead to war, which would be catastrophic given our other problems. The guards listened intently, recognizing this as more than a hypothetical exercise. These were the kinds of real-world problems their queen faced regularly. Your challenge, Isabella continued, is to propose a solution that addresses all 3 crises without creating new problems or significantly worsening existing ones. You have 60 seconds, starting now. The time pressure was deliberate and cruel. 60 seconds was barely enough time to fully grasp the complexity of the scenario, let alone devise a comprehensive solution. But Isabella wanted to see how they would respond under stress, whether they would admit uncertainty or grasp for quick fixes that ignored crucial variables. Captain Blackwood was the first to respond, his military training kicking in. Deploy half the southern garrison against the raiders, negotiate a payment plan with the Western Kingdom, and implement emergency food rationing. Isabella nodded politely. And the long-term consequences, Captain? The long-term consequences? Captain Blackwood repeated, clearly not having considered beyond the immediate problems. Reduced military presence at the southern border during a drought creates power vacuums that local strongmen will exploit, Isabella explained patiently. Payment plans suggest weakness to neighboring kingdoms, potentially encouraging further demands. Emergency rationing without addressing the underlying supply shortfall simply delays the crisis rather than solving it. Commander Sterling cleared his throat. Perhaps a diplomatic approach would be more appropriate. Send envoys to negotiate with the raiders while simultaneously arranging grain imports to address the drought. Better, Isabella acknowledged, but you're still thinking in isolation. What happens when word spreads that we're negotiating with raiders rather than decisively defeating them? What does that signal to other potential threats? Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth leaned forward, his earlier embarrassment replaced by determination to prove his worth. A coordinated response, Your Majesty. Use the threat of the raiders to justify requesting military assistance from our northern allies, assistance that comes with grain supplies. Frame the Western Kingdom's demands as unreasonable given our current security challenges, potentially gaining international support for our position. Isabella's eyebrows rose slightly. Now, that's more sophisticated thinking, Colonel. You're beginning to see the interconnections. She made a note on her score sheet. But you're still missing a crucial element, which is, Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth asked, his voice tight with frustration. Time, Isabella said simply. All of your solutions assume we have unlimited time to implement them. But crises don't wait for perfect solutions. The raiders are attacking merchant caravans today. The drought is affecting crop yields right now. The Western Kingdom expects a response within the week. She walked to the window, gazing out at the kingdom she had ruled for more than 2 decades. Real leadership isn't about finding perfect solutions to complex problems. It's about finding workable solutions that can be implemented immediately while laying the groundwork for longer-term stability. When she turned back to face them, her expression was serious but no longer hostile. The solution I actually implemented was to offer the raiders employment as border guards, turning enemies into allies while addressing the manpower shortage caused by drought relief efforts. I negotiated a joint trading venture with the Western Kingdom that made their reparations demands irrelevant while opening new markets for our goods. And I established grain reserves by temporarily reducing the royal household's expenses and redirecting those funds to emergency food purchases. The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable tension that had dominated the earlier challenges. This was the silence of grudging respect, of assumptions being forcibly reevaluated. The point, Isabella continued, isn't that you failed to find a right answer in 60 seconds. The point is that I didn't give you 60 seconds to think about it when it actually happened. I had to analyze the situation, consider the options, and make a decision immediately. Not because I'm particularly brilliant, but because that's what effective leadership requires. She returned to the table, but this time she did sit, her posture more relaxed, but no less authoritative. Which brings us to our final challenge, she said, producing one last piece of parchment. And this one, gentlemen, is going to test something that no amount of military training can provide, the ability to admit when you don't know something. The final piece of parchment that Queen Isabella placed on the table contained what appeared to be an impossibly complex mathematical equation, filled with symbols that none of the guards recognized. Greek letters intertwined with astronomical notations, geometric proofs bleeding into alchemical formulas, creating a dense tapestry of intellectual intimidation. This, Isabella said, her voice now carrying a weight of finality, is a problem from the advanced treatises of Master Cornelius of the Northern Academy. It combines principles of astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy. The guard stared at the parchment as if it were a coiled serpent. Even Lieutenant Thornwick, who had performed admirably on the earlier challenges, looked overwhelmed by the sheer complexity of what lay before them. Your task, Isabella continued, is to solve this equation. You have as much time as you need. Captain Blackwood leaned forward, his jaw set with determination. He had been humiliated too many times already this morning to back down now, regardless of how impossible the challenge appeared. His eyes scanned the symbols, searching for some pattern or principle he could grasp. "Your Majesty," he said finally, "I'm not familiar with several of these notational systems. Perhaps if you could provide some context." "Context, Captain?" Isabella's voice was deceptively mild. "Are you suggesting that you need help understanding the problem before you can solve it?" The trap was so elegantly laid that Captain Blackwood walked straight into it. "Not help, Your Majesty, just clarification of the parameters. I see," Isabella interrupted. "So, when faced with something beyond your immediate understanding, your instinct is to ask for assistance rather than admit ignorance." Captain Blackwood's face flushed red. "I'm attempting to gather the information necessary to solve a problem you don't understand using knowledge you don't possess," Isabella finished. "How admirable." Commander Sterling, recognizing the dangerous direction of the conversation, attempted to intervene. "Your Majesty, surely no one could be expected to solve such an advanced mathematical problem without proper training in the relevant disciplines." Isabella's smile was brilliant and terrible. "Exactly, Commander. Absolutely correct." She reached for the parchment and, with deliberate ceremony, tore it in half. "There is no solution," she announced, "because this isn't a real equation. It's a collection of random symbols designed to look impressively complex while meaning absolutely nothing." The silence that followed was deafening. Every guard in the room suddenly understood the trap they had fallen into. "The correct answer," Isabella continued, "was to recognize that you lacked the knowledge to even begin solving the problem and to admit that fact immediately. Instead, every one of you attempted to analyze meaningless symbols rather than acknowledging your limitations." She stood and walked around the table one final time, but now her movement seemed less like predation and more like a teacher making a crucial point. "In governance, gentlemen, I am regularly presented with problems that require expertise I don't possess. Economic theories I've never studied, military tactics beyond my training, diplomatic protocols from cultures I've never encountered. The difference between a wise ruler and a foolish one isn't the breadth of their knowledge. It's their ability to recognize the limits of that knowledge and seek appropriate counsel." Lieutenant-Colonel Ashworth shifted inconfortably. "Your Majesty, we've always striven to provide you with our best advice. Have you?" Isabella's question cut through his words like a sword through silk. "Or have you striven to make your advice appear so authoritative, so definitive, that I wouldn't think to question it or seek alternative perspectives?" She paused beside his chair, her presence commanding absolute attention. "When you present me with a military recommendation, Colonel, do you include the uncertainties, the potential weaknesses in your analysis, the alternative strategies you considered and rejected? Or do you present a single course of action as if it were the only reasonable option?" Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth's mouth opened, then closed without sound. The answer was written clearly on his face. "I thought as much," Isabella said, "and therein lies the fundamental problem we're addressing today." She returned to her own chair, but remained standing, her hands resting on its back. The morning light streaming through the great windows had shifted, casting long shadows across the stone floor, and with it, the entire character of the room seemed to have changed. "For 23 years," she began, her voice taking on a tone of quiet reflection, "I have ruled this kingdom. For 23 years, I have been presented with advice, recommendations, and counsel from advisors who speak with absolute confidence about matters of life and death." She paused, letting her gaze move from face to face, seeing each man in a new light. And for 23 years, I have watched those same advisors make errors in judgment that they never acknowledged, propose solutions that created new problems, and demonstrate blind spots that they never recognized, all while maintaining complete confidence in their expertise. Sir Edmund cleared his throat nervously. "Your Majesty, surely you don't doubt our loyalty or our commitment." "Your loyalty, Sir Edmund?" "Never." "Your commitment?" "Absolutely certain." Isabella's voice warmed slightly, acknowledging their dedication even as she continued her critique. "But your intellectual humility? Your willingness to acknowledge uncertainty? Your recognition that intelligence takes many forms and that wisdom can come from unexpected sources?" She shook her head slowly. "Those qualities have been notably absent." Lieutenant Thornwick, who had remained silent during the final challenge, finally spoke. "Your Majesty, what would you have us do differently?" Isabella's expression softened as she looked at the young lieutenant. His question was genuine, asked not from defensiveness, but from a real desire to understand and improve. "Excellent question, Lieutenant," she said. "Let me answer it with one final demonstration." She moved to a cabinet positioned against the far wall and retrieved a leather portfolio. From it, she extracted several sheets of parchment covered with her own handwriting, detailed analyses, calculations, and diagrams. "3 months ago," she said, placing the documents on the table, "you advised me to reject the Northern Kingdom's proposal for a new trade agreement. Your reasoning was sound, your analysis thorough, your recommendation unanimous." Captain Blackwood nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Majesty. The terms were unfavorable, and we believe they were attempting to exploit our kingdom's economic vulnerabilities. And yet," Isabella continued, "I approve the agreement anyway." The guards exchanged confused glances. This was not a decision they remembered, and the implications were troubling. "Because," Isabella explained, "my own analysis revealed factors that your reports had overlooked. Cultural considerations that would make refusing the agreement more costly than accepting it. Economic data that suggested their exploitation would actually benefit our long-term interests. Political intelligence that indicated this agreement was a test of our diplomatic maturity." She spread the documents across the table so they could all see her work. "I didn't reject your advice because I believed you were incompetent or disloyal. I overruled it because I had access to information you lacked and perspectives you hadn't considered." Commander Sterling leaned forward to examine the documents. "Your Majesty, where did you obtain this analysis?" "I created it," Isabella said simply. "I spent 3 weeks researching trade patterns, consulting with merchants and scholars, analyzing historical precedents, and modeling economic outcomes. I did the work myself because I couldn't trust that anyone else would approach the problem without preconceptions. The impact of this revelation was immediate and profound. Every assumption they had made about their queen's capabilities and involvement in governance was suddenly called into question. The trade agreement, Captain Blackwood said slowly, has indeed proven beneficial. More beneficial than anyone predicted. Yes, Isabella confirmed. Because the analysis that led to its approval was more thorough and more objective than the analysis that recommended rejection. She gathered the documents and returned them to the portfolio. This, gentlemen, is what I want you to understand. I am not your intellectual inferior. I am not a figurehead who requires your guidance to navigate complex problems. I am a ruler who has spent decades developing the skills necessary to govern effectively. And those skills include the ability to think analytically, reason logically, and make decisions under pressure. The great hall fell silent, except for the soft whisper of wine through the ancient windows. Outside, the kingdom continued its daily business, unaware that within these walls, the fundamental relationship between a queen and her advisors was being redefined. "But, Your Majesty," Sir Edmund said finally, "if you possess such capabilities, why do you maintain a council of advisors at all?" Isabella's smile was genuine for the first time that morning. "Now that, Sir Edmund, is the most intelligent question anyone has asked today." Queen Isabella walked to the great window once more, but this time her movement was contemplative rather than predatory. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the ancient stones of Ravenshollow Castle. When she turned back to face her guards, her expression had transformed completely. Gone was the sharp edge of challenge, replaced by something deeper and more thoughtful. "Sir Edmund asks why I maintain a council of advisors," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years of consideration. "The answer is both simple and complex." She returned to the table, but instead of taking her position of authority, she moved one of the chairs to face the others and sat among them as an equal. No single person, regardless of their intelligence or education, can possess expertise in every area required for effective governance, she began. "I may be capable of economic analysis, but I lack your military experience, Captain Blackwood. I can navigate diplomatic complexities, but I haven't spent decades studying our legal traditions as you have, Sir Edmund." The guards listened intently, recognizing that something fundamental was shifting in their relationship. "The problem," Isabella continued, "isn't that you possess knowledge I lack. The problem is how that knowledge has been shared." She gestured to the scattered remains of their morning's challenges. "Each of you approach these tests with the assumption that intelligence follows a hierarchy, that military experience trumps theoretical knowledge, that practical wisdom is inherently superior to analytical thinking, that a queen's role is to choose between options rather than to understand them." Lieutenant Thornwick shifted forward in his chair. "Your Majesty, what should we have done differently?" Isabella's attention turned to the young lieutenant with approval. "You, Lieutenant, actually demonstrated the correct approach several times this morning. When faced with the taxation problem, you didn't immediately propose a solution. You asked questions, examined the underlying patterns, considered multiple interpretations." She stood and moved to retrieve a fresh piece of parchment from her desk. "Let me show you what effective counsel looks like." She began writing as she spoke. 3 weeks ago, Commander Sterling provided me with a military assessment regarding the border fortifications. His report included not just his recommendations, but the assumptions underlying those recommendations, alternative strategies he had considered, potential weaknesses in his preferred approach, and factors that might require future reassessment. Commander Sterling looked surprised. "Your Majesty, I don't recall." "You don't recall because you weren't the one who wrote it," Isabella said with a slight smile. "That report came from Lieutenant Thornwick." The young lieutenant's face went pale. "Your Majesty, I never submitted any. No, you didn't submit it to me directly. But you submitted it to Commander Sterling as part of your analysis supporting his recommendations." Isabella's smile widened. "A piece of work that demonstrated exactly the kind of intellectual humility and analytical rigor I value most highly." She turned back to face the group. Commander Sterling, however, chose to strip out the uncertainties, the alternative viewpoints, and the analytical framework, presenting me instead with a simplified conclusion that appeared definitive and unquestionable. Commander Sterling's face flushed red. "Your Majesty, I thought it would be more helpful to provide clear guidance rather than burden you with thinking." Isabella's voice carried disappointment rather than anger. Commander, when you remove the analytical framework from a recommendation, you're not making my job easier. You're making it impossible. She began pacing again, but this time her movement was more like a teacher walking among students. A queen who receives only conclusions cannot evaluate the quality of the reasoning behind them. She cannot identify when circumstances have changed in ways that might invalidate the original analysis. She cannot adapt recommendations to address new information or unexpected developments. Sir Edmund leaned forward. But surely, Your Majesty, the role of advisors is to synthesize complex information into actionable guidance. Yes, Isabella agreed, but synthesis is not the same as oversimplification. When a physician diagnoses an illness, does he simply tell the patient, take this medicine? Or does he explain the nature of the disease, the reasoning behind the treatment, and the potential side effects? The reasoning behind the treatment, Sir Edmund admitted. Exactly, because an informed patient can recognize when symptoms change, when the treatment isn't working, when unexpected complications arise. An uninformed patient can only follow instructions blindly until those instructions prove inadequate. Isabella paused beside Captain Blackwood's chair. Captain, tell me about the most difficult military decision you've ever had to make. Captain Blackwood considered carefully before responding. The defense of Millbrook Village 3 years ago, Your Majesty. We received intelligence that raiders were planning an attack, but we couldn't determine whether they intended to strike the village directly or use it as a diversion while attacking the nearby supply depot. And how did you decide what to do? I analyzed the available information, considered our tactical options, weighed the potential consequences of each approach, and made the best decision I could with the time and resources available. Isabella nodded. And if one of your subordinates had simply told you defend the village without explaining their reasoning, would that have been helpful? Captain Blackwood's understanding dawned slowly. No, Your Majesty. I needed to understand the logic behind the recommendation to evaluate whether it was sound and to adapt it as circumstances changed. Precisely, Isabella said. And yet, when providing counsel to your queen, you consistently present conclusions without context, recommendations without reasoning, advice without the analytical framework that would allow me to evaluate its validity. She returned to her chair, but remained standing behind it, her hands resting on its back. Gentlemen, I'm not asking you to become less expert in your respective fields. I am asking you to become better teachers of that expertise. Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth spoke up, his voice uncertain. Your Majesty, how should we modify our approach to better serve your needs? Isabella's expression brightened considerably. Now that is the right question, Colonel. Let me be very specific. She moved to her desk and retrieved several bound volumes. These are examples of the kind of counsel I find most valuable. She opened the first volume and placed it where they could all see. This is an analysis from our Master of Coin regarding proposed changes to trade taxation. Notice that he doesn't simply recommend for or against the changes. He explains the economic principles involved, identifies the stakeholders who would be affected, models potential outcomes under different scenarios, and explicitly acknowledges the uncertainties in his analysis. She turned to another section. Here, he presents not just his preferred option, but 3 alternative approaches, explaining the trade-offs involved in each. He tells me not just what he thinks we should do, but how he arrived at that conclusion and what factors might cause him to change his recommendation. Sir Edmund examined the document with growing interest. This is remarkably comprehensive, Your Majesty, and remarkably useful, Isabella added. When I read this analysis, I don't just understand his recommendation. I understand the problem itself well enough to recognize when new information might require a different approach. She opened the second volume. This is a diplomatic assessment from our ambassador to the Eastern Kingdoms. Again, notice the structure: context, analysis, options, recommendations, uncertainties, and contingencies. Captain Blackwood studied the document carefully. Your Majesty, this appears to require significantly more time and effort than our current reporting approach. Isabella's smile was sharp. Yes, Captain, it does. It requires advisors who are willing to expose their reasoning to scrutiny, who are comfortable acknowledging uncertainty, who prioritize effective communication over appearing authoritative. She closed the volumes and returned them to her desk. Which brings us to the heart of this morning's exercise. The guards waited in expectant silence as Isabella gathered her thoughts. The challenges I presented to you today were not designed to humiliate you or to prove my intellectual superiority, she said. They were designed to demonstrate that intelligence is not a zero-sum game. She gestured toward the score sheet she had been maintaining throughout their session. Lieutenant Thornwick performed best this morning not because he is necessarily the most intelligent person in this room, but because he was the most willing to acknowledge uncertainty, to consider alternative perspectives, to admit when he didn't know something. Lieutenant Thornwick looked uncomfortable with the praise, but Isabella continued before he could protest. The quality I value most highly in an advisor is not brilliance, not experience, not even expertise, though all of those are important. The quality I value most is intellectual honesty. She picked up the score sheet and held it where they could all see. Lieutenant Thornwick received the highest score not by getting every answer right, but by demonstrating the thinking process behind his answers, acknowledging when he was uncertain, and showing genuine curiosity about problems rather than rushing to solutions. Captain Blackwood studied the scores with a mixture of surprise and chagrin. Your Majesty, I apologize for my performance this morning. Isabella's expression softened. Captain, there's nothing to apologize for. Today was a learning experience for all of us, myself included. She set the score sheet aside and faced them directly. What I learned this morning is that the problem isn't your capabilities or your dedication. The problem is that we've created a dynamic where you feel pressure to appear infallible rather than helpful. Commander Sterling frowned. Your Majesty? Think about it, Isabella explained. When you present recommendations to me, you're not just offering counsel, you're defending your professional competence. Any uncertainty you acknowledge might be seen as weakness. Any alternative you present might be interpreted as indecisiveness. Any acknowledgement of complexity might suggest that you're not qualified to handle the responsibilities you've been given. The guards exchanged glances, recognizing the truth in her observation. But that dynamic, Isabella continued, serves no one's interests. It doesn't make you better advisors, and it certainly doesn't help me make better decisions. She moved around the table one final time, but now her presence was reassuring rather than intimidating. Starting today, I want to establish new expectations for our working relationship. When you provide counsel, I want you to show your work. Explain your reasoning, identify your assumptions, acknowledge your uncertainties, present alternatives you considered. She paused beside each chair as she spoke. I want you to treat me not as someone who needs to be protected from complexity, but as someone who needs to understand it in order to govern effectively. Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth shifted forward. Your Majesty, what if our analysis reveals problems we cannot solve or questions we cannot answer? Isabella's smile was brilliant. Then we acknowledge those limitations and work together to address them. Perfect information is a luxury that rulers rarely enjoy, gentlemen. Our job is to make the best decisions we can with the information we have, while remaining alert to new data that might require us to change course. She returned to her position at the head of the table, but this time she sat down, placing herself at their level rather than above them. The relationship I want with my advisors is not one of superior and subordinate, but one of collaboration between experts with different but complementary areas of knowledge. Sir Edmund leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. Your Majesty, this approach will require significant changes in how we prepare our reports and presentations. Yes, it will, Isabella agreed. It will require more work, more thought, more humility. But it will also result in better governance and more effective solutions to our kingdom's challenges. She looked around the table one last time, seeing not just her guards, but her partners in the complex work of leadership. Gentlemen, are you willing to undertake this collaboration? The response was unanimous, though each man expressed it differently. Captain Blackwood straightened in his chair with military precision. Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth nodded with the gravity of long experience. Commander Sterling's agreement was measured and thoughtful. Sir Edmund's acceptance carried the weight of aristocratic tradition adapting to new realities. But it was Lieutenant Thornwick who spoke for all of them. Your Majesty, he said, his young voice carrying conviction that matches words, we are honored by your confidence and committed to earning it every day. Isabella smiled, the first completely genuine smile of the morning. Then let us begin. Outside the great windows of Raven's Hollow Castle, the kingdom continued its ancient rhythms, unaware that within these walls, the very nature of royal governance had just been transformed. The sun climbed higher, casting new light on old traditions, and, in that light, both queen and advisors saw their roles, and each other with fresh clarity. The morning's challenge was over, but the real work was just beginning.